Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto married Ino Yamanaka in the future. 16-year-old Ino is stuck in the body of her older self. Now she must embark on the journey of an adult, a wife, and a mother while deep down she's still just a child herself. What does the future have in store for her? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 41, Outtake, Whiskers. With 37-year-old Ino. Naruto. Ino called his name carefully when she finally found him sitting on a bench outside the hospital. He wasn't crying, so that was a good start. He did not look too depressed either, but more deep in thought. Naruto. He looked up and grinned. Hey. You're okay? Ino asked, confused. Shikamaru had made it seem that he was upset. Yeah, Naruto replied, I don't feel great, but Shikamaru spoke some sense into me. Oh. Ino sat down next to him. Shikamaru had clearly failed to mention that part. But as the two sat in silence, it sort of started to fall into place. Ino should have known things would not be quite the same as it had been in her dimension. Here, Naruto had clearly been comforted by Shikamaru, and her teammate must have really said something to shake Naruto out of his depressed state. Her own memory of the event happening in her dimension, all those years ago when her real friendship with the blonde began, was slightly different. Shikamaru had found Naruto outside the hospital, in tears, and could not calm the teenager down. Iruka had managed to stop him from crying, but it had been her to snap him out of it. How strange, up until now the events in the two dimensions had been very similar, but this was one of the first to have serious differences. Shikamaru needs my help with decoding a message from Jiraiya, Naruto stated. I just needed to sit down to breathe for a while. I see, Ino hummed. Are you sure you're okay? For now, Naruto replied as he leaned down and rested his head on Ino's shoulder. She smiled when she felt his hair tickle her cheek. She was happy to know that he wasn't as shy around her anymore. This is okay, right? Naruto asked. Of course, Ino laughed. She reached up and patted his cheek. The texture of his whiskers felt rough under her fingertips. She had almost forgotten how strange they felt. She hadn't touched her Naruto's whiskers in a long time since it was a very sensitive and ticklish spot. Strange, Ino muttered. What is? Naruto asked, lifting his head to look at her. Kaguya doesn't have whiskers. Who? Naruto asked, blinking. He knew Ino had mentioned the name before, but he could not for the life of him remember which person in the other dimension Kaguya was. Our daughter, Ino explained. The Nine Tails was still sealed inside of you when she was conceived. Naruto frowned. You mean, he's not inside me in your dimension anymore? No. And I'm alive? Ino rolled her eyes. No, Naruto, I married a zombie. Naruto sat up and crossed his arms, in deep thought again. Ino watched him, worried that perhaps she might have said too much. Naruto might be a lot more open to her now, but he was still slightly disturbed by the fact that they were married. It was, after all, a big revelation. Did I die? Naruto finally asked, looking her in the eye. Ino stared back, surprised by the sudden determination that she saw in his eyes. She could not determine where it suddenly came from, but he looked very serious. No, Ino replied, and that was all she was going to say. She knew there was no way Naruto had met his mother yet, therefore he did not know of the Uzumaki clan's strong life force and that they can survive a Bijuu's extraction. Don't worry about it, Naruto. I'm not, he retorted, I just wanted to know so I can be prepared. I can't die yet, have stuff to do. Gotta save Sasuke. Ino smiled. Yes, I suppose you do. I still think it's weird that he came back on his own in your dimension, Naruto pointed out. He's a weird guy, Ino hummed in agreement. And his socks stink. Naruto raised an eyebrow at that and then burst out laughing. Ino laughed with him, glad to see that he was in even higher spirits than before. Chapter 42, In Dire Judgment. With 16-year-old Ino. It was early morning. The streets in Konoha were quiet. In the Hokage's household, The Hokage and his wife were awake and preparing for the day in their room. Naruto was finishing buttoning his shirt, while Ino pulled a brush through her short blonde hair. Once she was done, she glanced at the coat hanging from a hanger on the door of the wardrobe. With a knowing smile, she grabbed it and sauntered over to Naruto and tapped him on the shoulder. Ino held up the white coat, and smiled as Naruto slipped his arms in and pulled it over his shoulders. The stitching on the back was neat, and even though Ino has been seeing it for months, it still surprised her to see the words. Once it was on, Naruto turned around to face her and returned the smile. "Ready?" Ino asked. She had to lift her head slightly to look at him properly. "I suppose," was the reply. He looked tired, and there was something else bothering him, she could see it in his eyes. "What is it?" she pressed. Naruto shook his head. "I don't know. It just feels like with everything about to happen, that our time is also running out." Ino nodded slowly. She understood. She felt the same. With the whole debacle with Ayaka, Astra, and the council finally ending, it almost felt like everything else would also suddenly fall into place. "I don't know how, or when," Ino whispered. "But I hope you find peace. And never forget." A strange emotion crossed Naruto's face, then he shook his head and grabbed her shoulders, so he could pull her against him. "I will never forget you," he whispered into her hair. She could feel the tears gathering in her eyes. "And I will never forget you." "Don't worry, younger me will totally fall in love with you," Naruto stated. "If you can make me fall in love with the same woman twice, then nothing will stand in your way." In the Hokage Tower there was a large room that had not been used in quite some time. And with the changes Naruto was making, the room's layout has also been changed. Instead of simply a long table and chairs, there was now 3 chairs by a large desk at the rear on a raised platform. Behind that was a door. Before that was open space, followed by 2 desks and 2 chairs at each on opposite sides of the room. Behind them was a series of benches. This was Konoha's new courtroom. And the people were filing in. Shizune was seated by one of the desks, the seat next to her empty. At the opposite desk sat a shinobi whose name Shikamaru could not recall, but he recognized his face. Other familiar faces were walking in and sitting on the benches, his wife, Kiba, Lee, Shino, members of the council and some others. Hinata entered with her eldest son, and they were seated towards the front. Sasuke and Karen entered together, but Karen sat next to Shizune at the desk, while Sasuke sat on the bench behind them. Some others also arrived, including Harino Range. Everybody stood when Naruto and Ino entered. Naruto greeted everyone politely, insisted everyone sit, and then the 2 blondes sat down next to Sasuke. Not long after, however, the door at the rear of the room opened and 3 individuals walked in. Naruto stood, and then motioned to the room to follow. "All stand for Tribunal Counselors Narashikaku and Yamanaka Inoichi, and for Tribunal Supreme Judge Harino Mabuki." The tribunal bowed slightly to the crowd, who returned the bow. The tribunal sat down by the desk on the platform, and then the rest of the room sat down as well. "Let us begin then," Mabuki announced. Hyuga Hashiko, more commonly known as Astra, was tried first. She was escorted into the courtroom by 2 shinobi and seated by the desk not occupied by Shizune and Karen. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and her skin incredibly pale. She refused to make eye contact with anyone in the room, her head lowered so she can stare absently at her hands folded in front of her on the desk. The man beside her stood up and moved to the center of the room. He cleared his throat and straightened before the tribunal. "Mr. Nara, Mr. Yamanaka, Ms. Mabuki," he began. "I am Obata. I am a medic at the Konoha Hospital. Hyuga Hashiko is one of my patients." "How long has she been your patient?" Inoichi asked. "About a month, sir," was Obata's reply. "And your diagnosis?" Shikaku asked. Obata nodded slowly. "She suffers severe psychosis and anxiety. From what I have been able to glean from her, she has struggled with these symptoms since childhood." The tribunal members nodded. Mabuki spoke next. "Thank you. And what does she stand accused of?" "Kidnapping, treason, use of illegal substances, use of mind control for nefarious reasons against the village and physical assault," Obata replied. I humbly ask the tribunal to judge her fairly, but please keep in mind that she is unwell. Mabuki smiled. We will, Obata. Please take a seat. We will now hear testimony for Hyuga Hashiko. With 37-year-old Ino. Ino stretched her arms high above her head as she inhaled the dry desert air. It was a typical morning in Sunagakure, unbearably hot. Ino had thrown off the covers early in the morning and had barely managed to not pull off her robe. She really hated such heat. But luckily it would not be a problem for much longer. Today was the day. Ino moved to the window to look out over the village and smiled. She felt content in a way, knowing that soon things should be completely settled and right again. Nodding to herself, she grabbed her things and headed for the bathroom. The house was quiet. Either its occupants had left for work, or they were asleep. Gaara rarely slept and he was very much a workaholic, so she wouldn't be surprised if he was already at his office. Tamari and Kankuro were also busy individuals and she had realized they got up and left early. So, she had the house to herself. After showering, she headed downstairs to search the kitchen for breakfast. She was surprised to find a spot on the table set with dishes and a note. Ino. Gaara told me you are likely leaving today. A hearty breakfast is important when traveling. There is rice in the rice cooker, miso soup on the stove, and fish in the fridge. Please help yourself. See you next time. Tamari. Ino smiled at the note and quickly got the food Tamari had listed. There was also some pickled radish already on the table on a little plate. Tamari had gone the whole mile for breakfast that morning. Ino took her time eating. She was in no rush and would need all the energy she could spare for what was to come. After eating, Ino decided it would be polite to do the dishes. She quickly washed up, then wiped the kitchen bench for good measure. Once she finished, she sighed and wiped her sweaty brow. As the sun rose higher, the air became drier and hotter. She couldn't wait to leave the intense heat. Satisfied that the kitchen was clean, Ino decided she would return to the guest room and get started on the first task she had to do. However, as she walked out of the kitchen and up the hallway, the front door opened with a loud creak. She turned around, curious to see who had returned home. It was Tamari. Her skin was red, and her breath ragged. She practically collapsed in the entryway and struggled to pull off her sandals. Ino quickly moved to her side. Are you all right? Ino asked. Tamari jumped in surprise. Oh, you scared me? The Sunakunoichi laughed. Did you run here? Tamari nodded, still out of breath. I was not sure if you would still be here. Ino quirked an eyebrow. You were looking for me? Yes, Tamari replied. She bit her lip, then sighed deeply. Konoha has been destroyed. With 16-year-old Ino. There was a tense silence in the courtroom. The tribunal had heard all testimony, and afterwards had retreated to a private area where they could discuss the outcome of the trial. The people left in the courtroom all sat uncomfortable and uncertain of how things would turn out. Hyuga Hashiko remained eerily quiet and still by the desk, her gaze still focused on her hands folded before her. Ino was especially restless. She was fidgeting with her fingers and tapping her foot on the wooden floor. Naruto, who was sitting more quietly next to her, noticed. Are you all right? He asked. Ino turned to look at him and nodded slightly. I am. I just hope the judgment is not too harsh. Naruto smiled. It will be just, but merciful. You know Inoichi, Shikaku, and Mabuki. They are not the type to be cruel. Besides, I would not allow a cruel punishment. It would serve no useful purpose that way. Ino inhaled deeply and nodded. You are right. I just feel like I am partly to blame for all this, you know. Naruto frowned as he watched Ino look down at her lap. Feeling protective, he wrapped his arm around her shoulders and pulled her against him. It is not your fault. But it is one of my alternate versions who abused her, Ino muttered. If it was not for that me, she would not have ended up like this. Naruto shook his head. I doubt the abuse she suffered is the only thing that led to her struggles. Besides, it was her choice to do what she did. She could have chosen differently. Ino sighed. I know. Karen was also restless and had abandoned her seat at the desk with Shizune to sit with her husband instead. She was tired, and honestly had little energy to deal with this whole trial business. She just wanted to return home to her children. But she knew moving forwards after the whole council nightmare needed this to happen. So here she was, and she had given her testimony. It will be over soon, Sasuke told her. I hope so, Karen sighed. Just as she said that, the door by the platform opened and the tribunal re-entered the room. Everyone stood up and bowed as the three took their seats. Once they were seated, the rest of the room's occupants sat back down. Inoichi spoke first. Will the accused please come forward? Obata stood up and helped Hashiko up. The two slowly made their way to the center before the platform. For the first time throughout the entire morning, Hashiko looked up, her pale gaze landing on Hyuga Hinata who sat amongst the crowd. A look of panic was on the younger woman's face. Hinata smiled encouragingly, which seemed to calm her. Obata stood with his patient as they faced the tribunal. We have heard and seen all evidence, Mabuki began. And we have come to a verdict. The tension in the air rose, if that were even possible. Hyuga Hashiko, Mabuki continued. You are hereby found guilty of all charges. And the tension popped. Ordinarily you would be sentenced to quite a number of years in prison for the severity and quantity of your crimes, Mabuki stated. However, considering that you are currently under the care of Konoha General Hospital, we have decided you will be sentenced 15 years. Hashiko looked up at Mabuki surprised, then blushed and looked back down at her feet. Mabuki continued, you will remain under custody in the hospital until Obata deems you fit to be moved to a secure facility. Usually at the end of your sentence we would ask you return to your dimension, however, since doing so would put you in danger, we have decided against this course of action. You may remain in this dimension until your death. Ino sagged in relief at the news that Hashiko would not have to return to her dimension. She would never wish such a fate on anybody. The woman herself also seemed relieved, as she sagged to the floor shaking and sobbing. Obata knelt beside her and was whispering to her. Probably trying to reassure her and calm her down. Obata, Inoichi cut in. The two of you will be escorted back to the hospital by security. A group of shinobi will arrive shortly to organize her constant supervision. The medic nodded. Thank you. We will adjourn for lunch, Shikaku stated. We will resume in 1 hour. Naruto had to excuse himself and go do some work in his office during the lunch hour, so Ino decided she would head home to spend some time with the children. Both Kaguya and Minato were currently at home being babysat by their grandmother. Kaguya had no missions currently and Minato had woken up with the sniffles, so Ino had decided to let him sleep. She also felt it best not to spread any potential diseases at school. Minato ran into her arms the minute she stepped into the house. Mama! He exclaimed. I missed you. Ino smiled warmly. I missed you too. She knelt and pulled him close. He smelled like soap and milk. And he was very warm. Suddenly missing him, she pulled him closer. She could not explain it, but she had a gut feeling that soon she would not be able to hold him like this anymore. Minato's little hands patted her back affectionately. After a minute or two, they pulled apart and Ino smiled at him. Have you had lunch? Not yet. Minato replied. Grandma is making waffles. Ino quirked an eyebrow. Waffles? Yeah. I wanted some. Ino chuckled. Okay, well, let's go see if Grandma needs help. Okay. Minato grabbed her hand and practically pulled her to the kitchen. Kaguya was standing by the kettle preparing tea, while Ino's mother was popping some cooked waffles into the oven to stay warm. Oh, Mrs. Yamanaka exclaimed at seeing her daughter. Hello, dear. Hi, Ino returned the greeting. Waffles smell great. Mrs. Yamanaka smiled. There's enough to feed an army. Ino snorted. Goof thing, I came home for lunch then. You want tea, Mama? Kaguya interrupted. Yes, please. Once Kaguya pulled out another cup and prepared the tea, she skipped over to her mother and embraced her. Ino returned the embrace wholeheartedly. Mrs. Yamanaka continued making more waffles. How is the trial going? She asked. Ino sighed. Good so far. One down, two more to go. Mrs. Yamanaka blinked. Two more? I thought they were only trialing Hashiko and Ayaka today. That was the initial plan, Ino conceded. But Naruto requested that Jugo be trialed today as well. No more waiting. Ah, Mrs. Yamanaka hummed. That is very true. And wise. The poor man deserves to be free. Ino nodded in agreement. Are the waffles ready yet? Minato demanded. The adult conversation had been confusing to him, and his little tummy was rumbling. He just wanted to eat. His grandmother laughed. Almost, my little wombat, almost. With 37-year-old Ino, Konoha had been destroyed. There was nothing left except rubble and a mountain of faces. Apparently after she had left, the Akatsuki had attacked to finally get their paws on Naruto. It had been chaos. Many died. And then by some miracle everyone returned from the dead. Thanks to Naruto and his ridiculous ability to talk sense into anyone. Ino had not been completely surprised when Temari had dropped the bombshell on her. There were enough similarities between their dimensions that Ino knew when Naruto left for training that Nagato and Konan's attack was not far behind. But she had decided not to worry about it. She had faith in Naruto. And as always, he had not failed his village. Besides, she had her own worries. The longer she stayed, the more danger she was putting her unborn child in. Leaving for Suna was necessary. And not running back to Konoha right now to go help was also necessary. Younger Ino, the proper Ino for this dimension, could go and help once this was all over. Temari had seemed put off by her aloof response to the news, but Ino did not let it bother her. She had a duty. Konoha was in no real danger anymore. They had Naruto. They would rebuild, and life would go on. Satisfied with her reasoning, and that nothing else required her attention, Ino returned to the guest room and settled on the bed. Before she could reverse the 5 dimensions to heaven, there was something important she had to do. She only hoped it would work this time. With 16-year-old Ino, Shimura Ayaka was escorted into the courtroom by Kurama. She struggled against his strong grip, and glared daggers at every individual in the room. When they passed Naruto, she spat at him. Kurama pulled her closer as a result, and a toothy smirk sent a shiver down her spine. Kurama had to practically push her into the center before the tribunal. She huffed and looked up at them in defiance. Shimura Ayaka, Shikaku began. You stand accused of treason, conspiring to overthrow the Hokage, and using mind control on the entire High Council to achieve your goals. Ayaka smirked but said nothing. We will now hear testimony, Inoichi said. Yamanaka Izumi was the first to step forward, and her appearance seemed to shock Ayaka. The middle-aged blonde woman had her arm in a sling, and it was clear that she had a slight limp, but she did not let this deter her. She walked with conviction and her head held high up to the platform and bowed before the tribunal. State your name, Mabuki requested. Yamanaka Izumi, the woman announced. I am the current council member for the Yamanaka clan. Were you influenced by the accused's jutsu? Shikaku asked. No, Izumi replied. It is why my arm is in a sling, Lord Shikaku. When Shimura Ayaka realized she could not control me, she deemed it necessary to get rid of me. Or well, she tried. Gasps echoed through the room. How come the jutsu did not affect you? Mabuki asked. I am a Yamanaka, Izumi stated. We are not easily tricked by jutsu that affect the mind. Mabuki turned to Inoichi, who nodded his head. Very well, please tell us everything you know, Mabuki requested. So, the proceedings went. Every single High Council member testified, even if they had been affected by the mind control jutsu. After that, Naruto was questioned, followed by several others involved, including the messenger who had come clean to Naruto all those months ago. Once again, when all was said and done, the tribunal left for a private discussion. Ayaka was escorted out of the room, since she refused to cooperate. She would return to receive her sentence. Naruto was restless this time. The problems with the High Council had bothered him for a long time, and to have reached this point had seemed impossible. He hoped Ayaka would be locked away for a long time. He did not wish for anything else, he was not the type of Hokage who would allow execution. They did not live in such a world anymore. The tribunal took less time to decide Ayaka's sentence than Hashiko's. The door swung open and they re-entered. Naruto motioned for the shinobi on security duty to go fetch Ayaka. They nodded and departed. Once the kunoichi was brought back into the room, everyone settled and got ready for the verdict. "Shimura Ayaka," Mabuki called. "You are found guilty of all charges." Ayaka sneered and it looked like she was about to say something, but one of the security grabbed her arm and gave her a pointed look. She sneered again. Mabuki continued, "In addition to all original charges, you are also found guilty of attempted murder, fraud, physical assault, and assisting in kidnapping. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Ayaka snorted and spat at Mabuki. The elderly woman did not flinch nor blink. "Please escort Shimura from the room." Getting the woman out of the room was a struggle, as she fought against the security. She managed to pull from their grasp and practically leaped towards Naruto. "I'll kill you!" She yelled viciously, although it came across slightly pathetic due to her being handcuffed. Kurama materialized out of nowhere. "Yeah, right. Hold your horses, Shimura." The Biju grasped her arm and pulled her away from Naruto, who looked ready to defend himself and the others in the room. Kurama turned to the tribunal. "Sorry, I should have stayed with her." Mabuki shook her head. "Never mind, just take her away." The fox grinned and did just that. Mabuki was tapping her fingers on the desk before her as she listened to another medic explain Jugo's condition to her. Honestly, it sounded like he was grasping at straws. "He cannot control the absorption of natural energy," the medic explained, "and this sends him into fits of rage. He has even destroyed an entire village in the past. Mabuki had heard enough. She sat up straight and lifted her hand to signal for the medic to be quiet. The medic quickly snapped his mouth shut but looked incredibly bewildered at being interrupted. "Is it possible for him to learn how to control his ability?" Mabuki asked. The medic gaped. "I'm sorry." Mabuki rolled her eyes. "I asked if he can be taught how to control his ability." "Lady Mabuki, if that were possible he would have already the medic began, but this time Shikaku interrupted. "He would have already learned." Shikaku completed the sentence. "That's what you were going to say, right?" Blood rushed to the medic's face and it was clear he was starting to feel uncomfortable. "It's a well-known fact that Jugo was one of Orochimaru's test subjects," Shikaku said. "Who knows what nefarious things the snake did to him? It could have made things worse. Besides, Inoichi added his 2 cents, even if he had someone to try and teach him, not all teachers are good at what they do. Perhaps he simply has not found the right teacher yet." Mabuki smirked. "Honestly, I do not understand why we are judging this man when it is obvious he simply needs some help." The medic now looked as red as a tomato. He stomped his foot on the floor, causing the few occupants in the room to snort at his childish behavior. Ino had to look away and stifle her laughter. The poor man, he was being roasted. But Mabuki had a point. "Lady Mabuki, I must insist." The medic decided to continue arguing, but the woman had had enough. She shook her head. "No," she hissed. "I have heard enough. Naruto, you are a sage, are you not?" All eyes turned to Naruto, who looked slightly sheepish. "Yes." "There," Mabuki hummed. "Problem solved. If Jugo still struggles in a year's time after being under Naruto's tutelage, we'll find him another teacher or consider alternative solutions." Case dismissed. Jugo, who had been silent throughout the entire trial, blinked in astonishment. Shizuka, who sat next to him, smiled excitedly and wrapped an arm around him. It took a little while for the verdict to sink in, but once it did, a smile blossomed onto Jugo's face. He turned to face Shizuka and pulled her close. "I'm free," he whispered into her ear. "You're free," she whispered back. Chapter 43, The Good Wife. Everything was white. Yamanaka Ino's eyes fluttered as she regained consciousness, and flinched at the bright white light that invaded her senses. She huffed and tried again, this time opening her eyes slowly. She sat up, expecting to find herself in bed, Naruto asleep next to her, but she was not in bed at all. An endless void surrounded her. All around, there was nothing but an expanse of white that continued on infinitely. Where was she? She stood up slowly, stretching her legs and rolling her shoulders. It was eerily quiet, and the feeling of weightlessness reminded her of when she was mind-walking. However, this place was empty. This was no brain, filled to the brim with memories and knowledge. She took a step forward, and winced at the loud echo of her own footsteps. That was not at all pleasant. She stopped. The echo continued. She was not alone. Tense, she slowly turned around, her heart beating furiously in her chest. She had no idea where she was, and thus had no idea who or what to expect. The person came to a stop once their eyes met. Ino's eyes widened. She was looking at herself. Platinum blonde hair cropped beneath the chin, eyes as blue as seafoam, signs of aging around the eyes and mouth. It was the appearance of 37-year-old Ino. The wife and mother. Confused, Ino looked down at her own hands. The wrinkles and calluses she had come to know the last few months were gone, and in its place were her youthful and supple skin. Wanting to confirm her suspicion, she lifted her arms to touch her head, and brush her fingers to the back. She met resistance, and further movement confirmed her thoughts. Long hair. She was back in her own body. She was a 16-year-old in her 16-year-old body. Which meant. She looked back up at the other Ino. Older Ino. Uzumaki Ino smiled. Hello, Ino. Ino blinked. Well, this was weird. This is. Ino began. Older Ino laughed. Confusing, right? Ino nodded. Older Ino shook her head, the smile still lingering on her lips. I can't hold the jutsu for long. But, I felt it would be prudent we speak before I reverse the 5 dimensions to heaven. Ino blinked. You figured it out. Yes, was the reply. Or, well, Gaara figured it out. Ino chuckled. Of course he did. Older Ino also chuckled, but then her expression sobered and she grew serious. I must reverse the 5 dimensions to heaven. It is an unstable jutsu, even with the tweaks. And I'm pregnant. Ino cut her off. I know. Older Ino looked startled, but it quickly faded. You have also experienced symptoms. Ino nodded. Yes, but the foetus is not physically with me. Older Ino sighed. Severe displacement then. Usually with a jutsu like this, that encompasses a form of teleportation, it is possible to leave behind a limb or injure yourself, but to transfer a foetus from one body to another? Yikes. We don't do things by half measure, Ino snorted. Older Ino chuckled. No, clearly not. Ino took a deep breath and released it. Regardless, it is not safe. So, I get it. You need to reverse it. And immediately. Older Ino nodded slowly. Yes. Ino worried her bottom lip, her heart suddenly feeling heavy. Will you let me say goodbye? Older Ino's gaze softened and she smiled warmly. He got you too, huh? Naruto is a very difficult man to not love, Ino replied. He is a dork, older Ino snorted. But, he is a special dork. Even as a teenager he already had that spark. I guess you want to say goodbye too, then. Older Ino smiled wistfully. I already have. Do I want to see him again? Yes, but I cannot. He is in Konoha. I'm in Sunagakure. Ino frowned. Suna. I did say Gaara fixed the problem, no. Oh, Ino said flabbergasted. I'm sorry. Older Ino brushed it off. No matter. I've had my time. Besides, dorky teenager Naruto belongs to you. Ino felt her cheeks grow warm. We're the same person, so he is ours. Older Ino rolled her eyes. Yes, all right. Ino smirked, then straightened, and placed her hands on her hips. How long? I will give you 24 hours. Ino nodded. She could work with that. I guess I'll wake up in Suna tomorrow, then. As a teenager again. Yes, older Ino hummed. You should be prepared for some surprises. Konoha was attacked. Ino gasped, her eyes widening. Attacked? Panic washed through her. Oh God, how bad was it? Who was wounded? Who was dead? And why? Why has Konoha been attacked again? Was it another war? Ino began, but older Ino cut her off. Akatsuki. Dread pooled in her gut. Oh God. Naruto. Is Naruto? He is fine. The seal probably nearly broke, if things went the same, but his father would have stopped it. Ino blinked. What? She shook her head. That was a lot of shocking information to take in. She opened her mouth to ask more questions, but the world around them suddenly shook under their feet. Ino stumbled, and with a small shriek quickly moved to regain her footing. Older Ino frowned. Ah, the jutsu is fading. I'm afraid we don't have long. You'll have to ask Naruto for the full story, when you return to Konoha. Ino sighed. Okay. Thank you for the warning, I suppose. Older Ino nodded. Suddenly, a thought occurred to Ino. Wait, do you think, due to the displacement, when you reverse the 5 dimensions to heaven, will we even retain memories of the last few months? Older Ino blinked, opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again when she could not form a response. Another tremor shook the void. Ino stumbled again, but this time lost her footing and fell over onto her knees. She groaned. That really hurt. Older Ino rushed forward and held out her hand to help Ino up. She took the older, wrinkled hand gratefully and allowed herself to be pulled up. Once she was stable on her feet again, she stepped back and returned her gaze to the older version of herself. Uzumaki Ino looked crestfallen. Well, she supposed that was her answer then. She closed her eyes in resignation and allowed reality to settle over her. I'm sorry, Ino, older Ino whispered. Ino shook her head. Whatever will happen, will happen. We can't stay like this. Nor delay the reversal. Even if I desperately want to. She opened her eyes to look at her older self one last time. She smiled. It was nice to meet you, Ino said wistfully. It was an honor to love your husband. Older Ino returned the smile. And the same to you. With 16-year-old Ino. The next time she opened her eyes, Yamanaka Ino came face to face with the beamed ceiling of the Hokage Manor. She was back in bed, the one she shared with 37-year-old Naruto. Said man was next to her, curled up on his side, facing her and snoring away. She turned her head to look at him, and had to stifle her laughter. His blonde hair was a mess, and drool was dribbling down his cheek to the pillow. A dork, indeed. The thought of not remembering this tugged painfully at her heart. Ino turned fully onto her side, fully facing the man she had come to love beyond measure. He shifted slightly, moving his arm to tug it below his pillow. She smiled as he snuggled into the pillow with a dreamy sigh. A strand of hair fell over his eyes, and even though he was asleep, Ino could not stop herself from reaching out and gently brushing it aside. She let her fingers linger for a moment, then let them slide down his cheek before she pulled back her hand towards her chest. Her chest felt heavy, and she could feel the tears threatening to spill. She sniffled and moved closer, pushing herself against Naruto as close as possible without waking him. She curled up, tucked her head under his chin and buried her face in his chest. His elbow was slightly in the way, but she paid it no mind. She closed her eyes and listened to his breathing. She must have dozed off a bit, because next thing she knew an arm wrapped around her waist. She jumped at the sudden movement, knocking her head against something hard and sharp. Ow! Naruto groaned. That's my chin. Ino blushed. Sorry. The arm around her waist tightened, and Naruto buried his nose in her hair. No, it's fine. Your head okay? Yes, Ino whispered. Why so cuddly this morning? Ino bit her bottom lip and sighed. We have 24 hours. Naruto pulled away abruptly, alarm on his face. What? Ino looked into his sky-blue eyes and smiled sadly. She figured it out. 24 hours and you'll have your wife back. The Hokage blinked. Oh. His brows furrowed before he shifted forward again, moving his other arm from under the pillow and stuffing it beneath her. Ino yelped as his strong arms pulled her closer against him. He tucked her head under his chin again. Okay, he whispered. 24 hours. Naruto insisted on spending the day together, as a family. Shikamaru was to be Hokage for the day, which he pointed out multiple times over the phone was incredibly troublesome. Kaguya was excused from training, and luckily it was the weekend, so Minato did not have school anyway. Have a seat, Naruto said as he pulled out one of the dining chairs. Ino chuckled. Aren't I making breakfast? No, Naruto said seriously. I am. Ino quirked an eyebrow. Really? You can cook something other than instant ramen, right? Naruto looked offended. Of course. Ino laughed, but sat down as instructed. Minato came skipping down the stairs and practically stormed into the open living space and kitchen. Daddy! I want to help! He exclaimed. Naruto looked at his son and smiled. Okay, buddy. Kaguya came strolling in next, arms crossed and sleep still heavy in her eyes. What's going on? We're making breakfast. Minato yelled loudly at his sister. Kaguya cringed. You are way too loud, she huffed. She looked up at her parents, saw her father's amusement, and her mother's own laughter, but there was something set in their eyes. She frowned, turning her head to look between them. What weren't they saying? Sit with your mother, Kaguya, Naruto said as he walked to the refrigerator. The men of the house will cook this morning. Kaguya stared at her father suspiciously, but he ignored her and went about preparing some eggs. She huffed and pulled out a chair to sit down next to her mother. Minato pulled over his stool, then hopped up next to Naruto so he could help. Seriously, what's going on? Kaguya asked her mother. Ino simply continued to smile, nothing. Just a family day. That night, Ino made sure to tuck in both of the children. To Minato, it was nothing unusual, and he insisted that they read a story. Naruto had to do voices for the characters and everything. Minato's laughs were loud and adorable as his father imitated various animals. Once the little boy faded into the world of dreams, Ino made sure he was tucked in properly before leaning down and planting a kiss on his forehead. She pulled back and watched his adorable sleeping face. No words could describe what she felt. She scrunched her nose and eyes shut, hoping to deter the tears. With a deep sigh, she leaned back down and gave the boy another kiss, before she brushed some hair out of his face. Good night, little wombat, she whispered. Kaguya was sitting cross-legged on her bed, nose buried in a book. When Ino entered, she looked up, her blue eyes questioning. You don't often tuck me in, anymore, Kaguya said. Ino shifted uncomfortably. So, Kaguya huffed. You and Dad have been acting weird all day. He makes breakfast, both of you looking sad. He does not go to work all day, instead stays glued to your side. You both insist we do things as a family. Ino smiled. What's wrong with that? Movie night was fun. Well, yes, Kaguya relented. But, still. You were smiling all day, but I can see the sadness in your eyes. What's going on? Ino sighed and sat down next to her daughter on the bed. It's complicated. But, tomorrow things will be back to normal again. Kaguya was not satisfied, and Ino could see it. She shook her head and wrapped her arm around the teenage girl's shoulders and pulled her closer. Don't question it, Ino whispered. Just enjoy it. Everything will be fine. Why does it sound like you are saying goodbye? Kaguya asked, her voice cracking. Ino simply shook her head again and held her daughter even more tightly against her. I'm not. Not really. Naruto and Ino curled up in each other's arms. The light had been switched off, and the room was plunged in darkness. They could barely see each other, but it did not matter. And so the day ends, Ino whispered. Indeed, Naruto whispered in return. 24 hours goes by too fast, Ino mumbled, her voice heavy. She had been biting back the tears all day, using all her willpower to stay strong, to stay happy. But now, here in the darkness, in Naruto's arms, she did not have much willpower left. Yeah. Ino closed her eyes, and a tear slipped down her cheek. She sniffled, but it did nothing to stop the tears that followed. She buried her face in Naruto's chest and let out a wail. His arms tightened around her. "I got you," he whispered, his own voice cracking. "I got you." Yamanaka Ino opened her eyes, and the ceiling that met her was not her own. It was brown and domed, and the air around her was hot and dry. She blinked, then sat up to scan her surroundings. For a moment, her head felt foggy, like she had been asleep for a very, very long time. She had no idea where she was, the room and its furnishings unfamiliar. Panic washed over her as she tried to sift through her last memories. What had she been doing? How did she get here? And where is here? Okay, first thing. Figure out where she was. She kicked her legs over the edge of the bed and quickly jogged to the window. The sun was bright, and was baking down on a vast desert village. She gaped at the sight. Sunagakur. What on earth was she doing in Suna? She racked her brain, trying to remember if perhaps she was assigned a mission to come here. Nothing. She could not remember being assigned such a mission at all. In fact, the last thing she could remember was finishing training with Shikamaru and Chuji. She had gone to Ichiraku's for some ramen, but had felt sick. Nothing after that. She could hear her blood rushing in her ears, feel her erratic heartbeat in her chest. Oh good lord! Did she have amnesia? "Ah, you are awake," a voice came from behind her. Ino jumped, and whirled around, eyes wide. Instinctively she reached for her weapon pouch, but brushed nothing but her clothed leg. Drat! She was unarmed. She met the piercing gaze of a pair of seafoam eyes. Oh! It was just Gaara. A wave of calm washed over her, abrupt and seemingly out of nowhere. Wait, just Gaara? Why was she so relieved to see him? She frowned. She barely knew him. Sure, they had met in the past, she was aware he was Kazekage and not at all like the boy he used to be. But, it definitely did not mean they were friends or anything. Gaara frowned, then shook his head. She was right. You overthink things. Ino furrowed her brows and narrowed her eyes at him suspiciously. She? Who was she? Gaara sighed and pulled out a flat object out of his pants pocket. He held it out to her, a neutral expression on his face. Ino glanced at his hand warily. It was a note, folded. She squinted, hoping to see what the writing on it said, but could not see anything from this distance. She looked back up at Gaara's face, still wary. He sighed, looking slightly miffed. When you were 4, you snuck into your mother's room to play with her makeup. You got lipstick everywhere, and when you realized you had broken one of her favorite colors, you knew you would be in a lot of trouble. Ino's eyes widened as his words sunk in. Gaara continued, but, when your mother found you she wasn't angry at all. She laughed, then helped you clean the mess. Afterwards she gave you the broken lipstick, and insisted that next time you ask for your own. Ino gaped. How? I heard you, Gaara said. I hear everything. Ino frowned. What did that mean? Was he like her? A mind walker? No, Gaara replied. My abilities are similar to yours, but it's not the same. Ino had no idea what to say to that, so she simply continued to stare at him. Gaara sighed again and motioned to his hand with his head. The note is for you. Take it. Ino hesitated. The note was for her? From whom? She took a deep breath and slowly shifted closer. She took the note from Gaara, and indeed saw her name scribbled on it. Oddly, it looked like her own handwriting. Weird. She glanced at Gaara once more, then moved away and unfolded the note. Ino. First of all, Gaara is a dear friend, so stop staring at him warily. Second, by the time you read this, the 5 dimensions to heaven will have been reversed. You should be back in your own body, in your own dimension and time period. If not, then Gaara lied and I ask that you punch him in the face for me. If all things went as planned, you probably have no idea how you came to be in Sunagakur. Or have a clue about anything I am even talking about. You were right. Displacement, and the laws of the universe, or universes now, I suppose, would probably mean our memories of what has transpired will be suppressed. To be honest, I never really listened to the universe. Gaara is a telepath. A powerful one. He has capabilities far beyond our family jutsu's scope. After our telepathic meeting, I went to him and asked that he help you, should you wish to remember. Remember what, you ask? Being teleported to another dimension, into another body, into a completely different time period. For several months you lived as me, a 37-year-old kunoichi from Konohagakure. Who am I? I'm an idiot. A woman who felt inadequate, and with a thirst to prove herself. I tried to push the boundaries of our family's jutsu, make mind reading more than what it is. It backfired, and we ended up in a multi-dimensional mess. I broke my husband's heart, nearly killed my unborn child, really. I'm an idiot. I must warn you, there is no guarantee that Gaara can recover your lost memories. There is also a risk of brain injury, so consider it carefully. And, if the reversal suppresses others' memories of the events too, that will probably also be undone. I have already said it, but I will say it again. It was an honor. And thank you for loving my husband when I was too stupid to do it myself. Yours. Uzumaki Ino. Ino looked up at Gaara, eyes wide. He simply looked back, passive as ever. She wanted to doubt it. All of it. But, she knew her own handwriting. She had no recollection of writing this, so even if what the letter says is bogus, the part of her memory being wiped was not. And like this Uzumaki Ino said, she never listened to the universe. With 37-year-old Ino. Minato, slow down. Uzumaki Ino yelled as she waddled up the stairs. The young boy giggled and disappeared beyond the stairs, far down the hall ahead. Ino groaned and tried to climb faster, but her swollen belly made it difficult. He has far too much energy, Kaguya muttered. Ino glanced at her daughter next to her and smiled. He gets it from your father, Ino insisted. You were also like that, once. Kaguya looked scandalized. No, I was not. Ino laughed and grasped her daughter's hand and squeezed. You were an adorable toddler. Kaguya huffed. Whatever. They reached the top, and found Naruto standing by the door to his office, Minato in his arms talking loudly and flailing his arms. Ino smiled at the sight. Nothing made her happier than seeing her family together, happy and whole. Naruto's eyes landed on her, and he smiled, one of those sexy smiles that made her toes curl. Once the two Uzumaki women reached him, Naruto leaned in and planted a kiss on her cheek. Hello, beautiful, he greeted. Ino huffed. I'm fat, not beautiful. Naruto blinked, glanced at her swollen belly, then back up at her face. Are we going to have this argument every single time you are pregnant? Ino's eyebrow twitched. Every single time? Are you saying you're going to plant more in me after this? Naruto's eyes widened and he gaped like a fish. Well, Kaguya made a gagging noise. Gross. Can we not talk about you making more siblings for me? Thank you. Naruto laughed nervously. Right, yes, He scratched the back of his neck. Ino chuckled. I'm pulling your leg, husband. Naruto huffed. Right. Let's go, shall we? He held out his free hand. Ino linked their fingers and nodded with a smile. Yes, let's go. Ino had never seen so much emotion on Hyuga Masahiro's face before. He looked ready to burst into tears. Hinata, dressed in her travel gear, with a new flat stomach, toothed as she caressed his cheeks lovingly. My son, she hummed, a smile on her face. Do not cry. Suna is not that far. Masahiro furrowed his brows. I won't cry. Don't be silly, woman. Hinata chuckled. Of course not. The head of the Hyuga clan does not cry over his mother leaving. Masahiro nodded seriously. His pale eyes shifted to Gaara, who was standing nearby, a wrapped bundle in his arms. The Kazekage was cooing at the bundle, smiling and radiating happiness. I'm glad you found him, Masahiro whispered to his mother. Hinata glanced at her husband and smiled. So am I, she whispered back. Oi, Gaara, Masahiro called out. The Kazekage looked up, a curious expression on his face. If anything happens to my mother, you're dead, Masahiro said, his tone serious. Masahiro. Hinata gasped. Gaara snorted. Son, we had this discussion years ago. When I married her. Masahiro crossed his arms, pretending to still be serious, but he was smiling. Just making sure, father. Gaara's gaze softened, while Hinata had to fight back her tears. Masahiro had never called Gaara father before. I'm hungry. A small voice suddenly interrupted the moment. All eyes turned to little Daisuke, who was standing next to his father and sister. Misako elbowed him in the ribs and rolled her eyes. Gaara and Hinata laughed. Hinata moved to her youngest son and knelt before him. I have some snacks in my bag. We'll eat them soon, okay? Daisuke pouted. Okay. Hinata stood and held out her arms, waiting for her husband to transfer their newborn daughter back into her arms. Gaara did so, but first he planted a kiss on Madoka's forehead. Once that was done, they turned to the Uzumaki family, who had been observing things quietly. Well, Gaara said. I do not know how you convinced the Hyuga elders, Naruto. But, convince you did. Naruto shrugged. I'm charming. Gaara snorted, while Hinata chuckled and shook her head. We are grateful, Naruto, Hinata said warmly. I never thought I'd be able to move to Suna. Especially not without the seal. Naruto smiled. The world has changed. We are all allies now. May as well be the same village. This secret-keeping thing is getting old and stupid. Besides, your kids might have the Byakugan and they are Suna citizens by birth, so honestly we avoided a diplomatic mess here. Regardless, we thank you, Gaara insisted. A loud whistle echoed through the station. Ah, sounds like our train is ready to depart, Gaara observed. Hinata turned to her young children. Got your bags? She asked them. Misako and Daisuke both nodded. Gaara placed his hand on Masahiro's shoulder. Take good care of the Hyuga family, son. I will, Masahiro replied. Gaara nodded with a smile, then turned to Naruto. They shook hands, after which Gaara gave Ino a brief embrace, then ruffled Minato's hair. The boy giggled. Kaguya also received a handshake. Hinata hugged everyone, and planted a kiss on Minato's cheek. He groaned and very obviously wiped at his cheek. The adults laughed. The children also said goodbye to each other, before Gaara, Hinata and their children boarded the train. As the train started slowly moving, the family waved from their compartment. Masahiro and the Uzumakis waved back. Ino could see the tears flowing down Hinata's cheeks. As promised, Masahiro did not shed tears, but Ino could tell he was fighting them back with great difficulty. For years he had been by his mother's side, unyielding and ever her trusty companion. This was new, and it would be difficult. But, Ino knew he would make a great leader. Things were settling down now. Masahiro was adjusting to his new position. New council members had been elected, this time democratically. Shimura Ayaka was rotting in prison. Hyuga Hashiko was still in the hospital. Karen was healthy and safe. Yugo was thriving under Naruto's tutelage. Ino glanced at her husband, who was standing with his hands on his hips, smiling. He looked so handsome, with the sun shining and brightening his already bright blonde hair. They were happier. Her notebook, the one with everything on the 5 dimensions to heaven, was gone now. Tossed into a fire and burned to a crisp. Oh, yes. And, of course, Ino remembers. There was a Gaara in this universe too, after all. With 16-year-old Ino. She had no words. Ino stood, flabbergasted by what was supposed to be the gates that lead to Konoha. The gates were not there, instead there was nothing but rubble and dirt, mountains of it piled high. People were scurrying about, all of them busy. Some were moving the rubble, clearing buildings. Others were setting up scaffolding, hammering down as they rebuilt what was lost. Tents were set up everywhere, with even more activity happening around them. And above them all, the 5 Hokage watched over the village in their stone-cold silence. Gaara had not lied. Konoha had been flattened. Ino gulped. God, she hoped her parents were all right. Gaara had little to tell her about the aftermath of the attack. All she knew was that the Akatsuki had attacked, Naruto had lost control and nearly sprouted all 9 of Kurama's tails, and that Tsunade was in a coma. If only older Ino could have told her more. Ino was not at all prepared for this. Ino! A familiar voice called out. Ino turned to her right, and gasped as she saw Chuji in the distance, bag of chips in hand. Where on earth had he managed to get a bag of chips? Never mind, seeing him was, she bit her lip to stop the tears. He was dead in the other dimension. Seeing him alive and whole was, it was shocking. And a relief. She nearly ran to him and flung herself into his arms, but managed to control herself. Instead, she slowly made her way to him. Hey, Chuji, she greeted. You're Ino, right? Chuji asked. Ino laughed. Yeah, it's me. He grinned. Great. This must be quite a shock to you, huh? Ino looked around. Yeah. I was warned, but seeing it is different. Chuji asked. Ino nodded. She returned her gaze to her teammate. My parents. She intentionally trailed off, feeling a bit nervous about saying it out loud. Chuji understood. They're fine. Ino sighed in relief. Thank God. And everyone else? Chuji nodded. All accounted for. Hinata and Naruto have made a full recovery following the battle. Did you hear? Ino interrupted, yes, I heard. She had not known about Hinata, though. The girl had been injured? Everyone is helping with rebuilding now. Except Sakura, she's permanently in the medical tent. I figured, Ino said. Her heart clenched at the mention of Sakura. Another friend who had died in the other dimension. Ino had missed her. She would have to make sure to catch up with the girl soon. An awkward silence fell, but luckily it was broken by the interruption of a certain man with a ridiculous ponytail that resembled a pineapple. Shikamaru looked tired and bored. As always. He was slouching and had his hands in his pockets. He did, however, smile upon making eye contact with Ino. You're back, he said. Hello, Ino. She smiled. Hey. Shikamaru turned to Chuji. Oi, as troublesome as it is, we need to get back. Chuji munched on some chips and nodded. Right. Shikamaru turned to Ino. You better check in with my dad. He'll probably want you to help Ibiki or Sakura. Ino nodded. Of course, I'll go do that. Ino shifted her feet, and worried her lip. She knew she should report in, but honestly there was something else she wanted to do first. Shikamaru frowned at her, then snorted and shook his head. The idiot is helping out in the southern part of the village, he said. Already back on his feet, the bastard. Chuji grunted. I always wondered why he never got sick or healed so fast. Now I get it. Shikamaru rolled his eyes. It took you this long to figure it out. Oi. Chuji huffed. We can't all be as smart as you. Ino laughed boisterously. I missed you too. Yeah, go already, woman. Shikamaru huffed and waved her off. Ino chuckled again and waved as she ran off, excitement coursing through her. Running through Konoha now was strange. Everything was gone, but the rebuilding was well underway. Ino slowed when she reached what was once the southern suburbs, hoping to find who she was looking for amongst all the rubble and business. You all right there, girlie? An elderly man carrying some lumber asked. Yes, she answered. I'm just looking for someone. Who you looking for? The man asked. Ino hummed. A boy my age. Not much taller, also blonde. Wears orange, despite it being the most ridiculous color choice for a ninja. The elderly man's eyes lit up. Oh. You're looking for Naruto? Ino blinked. Yes. You know him. The man laughed. Know him? Girl, the whole village knows of him. He's a hero. Ino gaped. Okay, that she had not expected. She really needed to find the blonde and speak to him. It was high time she was caught up with everything that had happened. Hey, old man Goro, I got you tea. A familiar voice called out. The elderly man turned to the voice, while Ino stood frozen, butterflies suddenly in her stomach. His footsteps were getting closer. Oh! Goro exclaimed. Speak of the devil. She did not know why she was so nervous. He was not a stranger, after all. And she was not the type to get tongue-tied like this. But, things were different now, weren't they? Due to everything that had happened. Ino took a deep breath, then turned around. It had only been a few months, but it was almost as if she hadn't seen him in years. Or, perhaps, Ino had just never paid enough attention to him in the past. Because he was breathtaking. Her face flushed as she stared, wide-eyed, as Uzumaki Naruto came to a standstill before her. Teenage Naruto was not as bulky as adult Naruto. His hair was shorter, and his skin lacked the wrinkles she had grown accustomed to. But, it was still Naruto. In his ridiculous orange tracksuit, and the wide goofy smile. He had 2 cups of tea in his hands. Ino! Naruto exclaimed when his blue eyes landed on her, wonder in his voice. He blushed a deep red, then glanced at the old man. Goro looked between them, observing the flushed faces, then smirked. I'll take the tea, boy. Give it here. Naruto wordlessly handed over the tea. Goro turned on his heel and sauntered off, cackling softly. Ah, young love, the old man whispered to himself. An awkward silence fell over the 2 blondes. Ino was not sure what to say. She had no idea how much Naruto knew. What had older Ino shared with him? How could she possibly explain things to him? She took another deep breath and looked him right in the eyes, determined. She opened her mouth, ready to start, but before she could even get a word out, Naruto suddenly stepped forward, cupped her cheeks and pulled her into a searing kiss. She gasped into the kiss, not having expected it, at all. But, his lips were warm, slightly chapped and the passion sent shivers down her spine. The good kind. She melted into it, closing her eyes and returned the kiss with full fervor. It did not last long, as Naruto pulled away far too soon. Ino whined as he did so, her eyes fluttering open. His right hand moved from her cheek to her neck, digging into the base of her ponytail. His blush seemed even more red than before, if that was possible. Not that she could talk, Ino's cheeks felt like they were on fire. He looked nervous, but also had a small smile on his face. Sorry, he whispered. I've kind of wanted to do that for a while now. Ino whimpered. Really? He leaned in closer and bumped his forehead against hers. Yeah. Ino swallowed thickly. You are aware I am. She trailed off, not sure how to put it into words. Naruto grinned. That you are 16 and that this is very uncharted territory for these versions of us. Ino nodded. Okay. At least, he was not completely clueless. She pulled her arms back in, letting her hands settle on his shoulders. And we are just going to. His grin did not fade. Yeah. I mean, if you want to. Ino vigorously nodded her head. Yes. Of course I want to. We'll just take it slow, yeah. Yeah, he whispered back. That's it for part 8. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.